The moment I realized my parents truly didn't love me happened on my 18th birthday. Most people remember turning 18 as a celebration. Freedom, adulthood, a fresh start. I remember standing in our kitchen holding a garbage bag full of my clothes while my mother pointed toward the front door. "You're an adult now," she said coldly. "It's time you figured things out on your own." For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. Then I looked at my father. He didn't say a word. He just sat at the table drinking coffee like this was a completely normal conversation. Like watching your son get thrown out of his home was no different than watching the evening news. My younger brother Ethan stood behind them, avoiding eye contact. Nobody defended me. Nobody asked where I would go. Nobody even wished me a happy birthday. I remember feeling strangely calm. Not angry. Not yet. Just numb. Because deep down, I wasn't surprised. This wasn't something that happened overnight. It had been building for years. In my family, Ethan was the golden child. I was the backup plan. The mistake. The kid who could never quite measure up. If Ethan brought home a B on a test, my parents praised his effort. If I brought home straight A's, they asked why I hadn't joined more extracurricular activities. When Ethan forgot chores, he was still learning responsibility. When I forgot something, I got lectures about disappointment and failure. The rules were always different. The expectations were always higher. And somehow, I was always the problem. For years, I kept trying. I thought if I worked harder, they would notice. If I got better grades, they would be proud. If I stayed out of trouble, they would finally love me the way they loved Ethan. But nothing changed. Every achievement felt invisible. Every mistake became evidence against me. The only person who ever made me feel like I mattered was my grandmother, Evelyn. Grandma never treated me differently. She never compared me to Ethan. When I won a science competition in high school, she drove 3 hours just to attend the ceremony. When I graduated near the top of my class, she framed my certificate before my parents even acknowledged it. Most importantly, she listened. Really listened. One afternoon when I was 16, I finally asked her a question that had been haunting me for years. "Why don't they like me?" The words came out before I could stop them. Grandma looked heartbroken. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "sometimes people decide who you are before they ever give you a chance to show them." I never forgot that. A few years later, after being pushed out of the house, I packed everything I owned into my old car and left town. Nobody stopped me. Nobody called. Nobody checked if I arrived safely. The silence hurt more than any argument ever could. Except for Grandma. Every Sunday, without fail, she called. No matter how busy life became, we talked. For 15 years, she remained the one constant person in my life. The one person who believed I was worth something. And that's why, 15 years later, when her calls suddenly stopped without explanation, a feeling of dread settled deep in my chest. Because if there was one thing I knew about Grandma Evelyn, she would never disappear without a reason. After I left home, I made a promise to myself. I would stop chasing people who had already decided I wasn't worth loving. It wasn't easy. For years, a small part of me still hoped my parents would change. Maybe they would finally realize what they'd done. Maybe one day my phone would ring, and I'd hear my father apologize. Maybe my mother would tell me she was proud of me. That call never came. Instead, something stranger happened. The farther away I moved, the better my life became. I worked hard, finished college, and eventually built a successful career in software development. I bought my own home, paid off my debts, and created a life that felt stable for the first time. Ironically, the only reason my parents ever contacted me was when they needed something. A favor, money, technical help, advice. The conversations always followed the same pattern. They would act friendly for a few minutes before asking for something. Once they got what they wanted, the warmth disappeared. Meanwhile, Ethan remained the center of their universe. Every family phone call somehow became about him. His promotions, his vacations, his relationships, his problems. Even when I shared good news, the attention quickly shifted back to him. At first it hurt. Eventually, it became predictable. What I couldn't understand was why Grandma remained so different. No matter how much favoritism existed inside the family, she refused to participate. Every Sunday she called. Every birthday she remembered. Every achievement she celebrated. When my parents ignored my promotion to senior engineer, Grandma mailed me a handwritten card. When I bought my first house, she drove 6 hours just to see it. She treated me like I mattered. And because of that, I think my parents quietly resented her. Looking back, I can see signs I missed at the time. Whenever Grandma praised me during family gatherings, my mother's expression would change. Whenever she defended me, the room became tense. Whenever she talked about how proud she was of me, my father would immediately change the subject. At the time, I thought it was awkward family dynamics. Now I know it was something much darker. About a year before Grandma disappeared, she mentioned updating her will. The conversation lasted less than a minute. She laughed and said she wanted everything organized while she was still healthy. I didn't think much of it, but my parents reacted differently. The room went silent. My mother suddenly became very interested in the details. My father started asking questions. How much paperwork was involved? Had she spoken to an attorney? Had she made final decisions? Grandma politely brushed them off, but I never forgot the way they looked at each other afterward. It was the kind of glance people exchange when they're thinking the same thing without saying it aloud. Months later, things began changing. Grandma became harder to reach. Calls ended quickly. Sometimes she sounded nervous, sometimes distracted. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, she'd pause before answering. Of course, sweetheart. But something felt different. The warmth in her voice was still there. The confidence wasn't. Then came the missed Sunday call. Then another. And another. When I contacted my parents, they immediately dismissed my concerns. She's getting older. Stop overreacting. Everything is fine. The more questions I asked, the more irritated they became. And for the first time in my life, I started wondering if the lies they had told about me for 15 years weren't the only lies they had been telling. Because deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just had no idea how far they had already gone. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives all at once. Most of the time, it happens slowly. So slowly that by the time you realize what's happening, the damage is already done. After my parents convinced me that everything was fine, I tried to believe them. For a while, I forced myself to focus on work. I attended meetings, finished projects, went through my daily routines. But every Sunday felt wrong. For 15 years, Grandma and I had spoken every single week. Then suddenly, nothing. No calls. No messages. No birthday cards. No random voicemails reminding me to eat healthier or get more sleep. Just silence. At first, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe her phone was broken. Maybe she was traveling. Maybe she simply needed some rest. But deep down, I knew better. Grandma wasn't the kind of person who disappeared. Weeks passed, then months. The silence became unbearable. I started calling more frequently, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. Every call went unanswered. Every voicemail remained untouched. Whenever I contacted my parents, their responses became shorter and colder. She's fine. You worry too much. Stop making a big deal out of nothing. At one point, my mother actually sounded annoyed that I kept asking, as if being concerned about my grandmother was somehow unreasonable. That conversation stayed with me, because for the first time, I noticed something I had ignored for years. My parents weren't trying to reassure me. They were trying to shut me up. And those are two very different things. Meanwhile, the uncertainty started affecting every part of my life. I struggled to sleep. My concentration slipped. Friends asked if something was wrong. I always said no. The truth was harder to explain. How do you tell someone you're terrified for a person you love when everyone around you insists you're imagining things? The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the helplessness. Every day felt like standing outside a locked door while hearing something terrible on the other side. You know something is wrong. You just can't prove it. One evening, I sat alone in my living room staring at my phone. I opened our old message history. Years of conversations filled the screen. Holiday photos, birthday wishes, bad jokes, pictures of her garden. Simple moments that suddenly felt priceless. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard her laugh. That thought hit me harder than I expected. For most of my life, Grandma had been my safe place. When my parents made me feel unwanted, she reminded me that I mattered. When life became difficult, she gave me perspective. Now that voice was gone, and I had no idea why. The silence became so heavy that I started questioning myself. Maybe my parents were right. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe nothing was wrong. Maybe I was letting old family wounds cloud my judgment. For a few days, I almost convinced myself to let it go. Then the envelope arrived. Plain white. No return address. No explanation. Just my name written across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At first glance, it appeared completely blank. But as I tilted it toward the light, I noticed tiny marks in one corner. Small dots arranged in a pattern I recognized instantly. My heart began pounding. Because 15 years earlier, my grandmother had taught me that exact code as a game. And the message hidden inside wasn't complicated. It was only one word. One terrifying word. Help. In that moment, every excuse, every lie, and every month of silence suddenly made sense. Something had happened to Grandma. And whatever it was, my parents had been hiding it from me all along. Looking back now, I think the hardest part wasn't being treated like I was worthless. The hardest part was spending years believing it. When people tell you the same thing long enough, it starts to become part of your identity. You stop questioning it. You stop fighting it. You simply accept it. For a long time, that's exactly what I did. Even after leaving home, I carried my parents' voices with me. Every mistake felt bigger than it was. Every success felt temporary. No matter what I achieved, a small part of me still felt like the unwanted kid standing in that kitchen on his 18th birthday. But life has a strange way of forcing you to grow. One step at a time. One decision at a time. I focused on things I could control. My education. My work. My future. While other people chased approval, I chased stability. I learned new skills. Worked late when necessary. Saved money instead of spending it. Little by little, the life I built started feeling solid. Not perfect, just mine. For the first time, nobody could take credit for my success. Nobody could tell me I hadn't earned it. The house I bought was mine. The career I built was mine. The confidence I developed was mine. And unlike the approval I had spent years chasing, those things couldn't disappear overnight. Grandma noticed the change before anyone else. During one of our Sunday phone calls, she laughed and said something that stayed with me. "You don't sound like you're trying to prove yourself anymore." I remember smiling, because she was right. For years, every achievement had been an attempt to convince someone else that I mattered. Now, I was finally learning that I didn't need permission to value myself. That realization changed everything. Ironically, the stronger I became, the less interested I was in proving anything to my parents. I stopped expecting apologies, stopped hoping for recognition, stopped waiting for them to become different people. The anger slowly faded, not because they deserved forgiveness, because they no longer controlled my happiness. For the first time in my life, I felt free. At least, I thought I did. Then Grandma's call stopped, and suddenly, the peaceful life I had spent years building didn't feel peaceful anymore. The unanswered phone calls lingered in my mind. The excuses from my parents felt rehearsed. Every conversation raised more questions than answers. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, couldn't prove it, but the feeling refused to go away. The strange part was that my instincts had never been stronger. Years earlier, I probably would have ignored them, doubted myself, accepted whatever explanation I was given. Not anymore. The person I had become was different, calmer, more confident, more willing to trust his own judgment. Which is why, when that mysterious envelope finally arrived in my mailbox, I didn't hesitate. I didn't second-guess myself. I didn't listen to the excuses. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. Whatever was happening to Grandma wasn't an accident. And for the first time in 15 years, I was about to stop being the person who stayed silent. The morning after I received Grandma's coded message, I booked the first flight home. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't warn anyone. For years, they had convinced me to doubt my instincts. This time, I trusted them. The moment I arrived, things started falling apart faster than I expected. Grandma's house looked abandoned. The garden she spent years caring for was dying. New locks had been installed on the doors. And according to the neighbors, nobody had seen her in months. Months. That was the moment I stopped searching for explanations and started searching for evidence. What I found was worse than anything I imagined. Bank accounts had been emptied. Property paperwork was being transferred. Personal belongings had disappeared. And every trail somehow led back to my parents. But the most important discovery came when investigators finally located Grandma. She was living in a neglected assisted living facility hours away from her home. When she saw me walk through the door, she burst into tears. Then she handed me a folder. Inside was everything. Bank statements, copies of signatures, financial records, property documents, months of carefully collected evidence. While my parents thought they had isolated her, Grandma had been quietly documenting everything. For the first time, The truth wasn't based on suspicion. It was based on proof. The legal process took months. Long, frustrating months. My parents denied every accusation. They claimed they were helping Grandma. They claimed she had approved everything. They claimed I was overreacting. For a while, some relatives believed them. After all, my parents had spent years controlling the family narrative. They were respected, trusted, believed. I was the son they had always described as distant and dramatic. But facts are stubborn things. And eventually, facts started winning. Bank employees testified. Documents were verified. Signatures were examined. Former caregivers spoke up. One piece of evidence became 10. 10 became 50. The story my parents had spent years protecting slowly collapsed under its own weight. The most satisfying part wasn't the courtroom. It wasn't the legal rulings. It wasn't even the financial penalties. It was watching people finally see the truth. For years, my parents had convinced everyone that they were caring, responsible, and selfless. Now relatives learned how they had isolated an elderly woman, how they had taken control of her finances, how they had lied to family members, how they had hidden the truth from everyone. The respect they spent decades building disappeared almost overnight. Not because I destroyed it, because their own actions did. In the end, every stolen asset was returned. The property transfer was canceled. Grandma regained control of her finances. And the people who once defended my parents quietly stepped away from them. The role reversal was impossible to ignore. For most of my life, my parents held all the power. They controlled the story. They controlled how people saw me. They decided who mattered and who didn't. Now, for the first time, they couldn't control anything. Not the evidence. Not the consequences. Not the truth. And the person they had spent 15 years treating as worthless became the one who protected the family member they had abandoned. I didn't celebrate. I didn't seek revenge beyond that. I simply watched the truth do what it always does eventually. It came into the light. And once it did, there was nothing my parents could do to hide from it anymore. The strange thing about justice is that people imagine it looks dramatic. They picture shouting, arguments, big emotional confrontations. But most of the time, it looks much quieter than that. After the legal case ended, my life became surprisingly peaceful. Grandma moved into a small cottage community near my home. It wasn't extravagant, just safe, comfortable, close enough that I could visit whenever I wanted. For the first time in years, she didn't have to worry about who was controlling her phone calls, her finances, or her decisions. She was free again. And honestly, that mattered more to me than anything that happened in court. As for my parents, the consequences followed them long after the legal paperwork was finished. People who once trusted them no longer did. Family members stopped calling as often. Invitations became rare. Conversations became uncomfortable. The reputation they had spent decades building slowly disappeared. Not because anyone launched a campaign against them. Because once people saw the truth, they couldn't unsee it. My father tried reaching out several times. At first it was through emails, then letters. Eventually, phone calls. Most of them sounded strangely similar. He talked about mistakes, misunderstandings, how the family needed to heal. What he never talked about was accountability. He wanted reconciliation, without responsibility. And those two things aren't the same. My mother waited longer. Nearly a year passed before she contacted me. When she finally did, her message was only a few sentences. For the first time in my life, she sounded old. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone who had spent too much time sitting alone with choices she couldn't undo. She wrote that she wished things had been different. She wrote that she regretted how everything ended. As if their opinion never mattered at all.